give teachers and police officers and first responders access to money so that they can live in the city. So there are some programs that we're trying to increase them living in the city. And it's real important if we have an earthquake or something to have our officers close and nearby. So we're very cognizant of that. So I don't know if that answered your question.
I think also it's important not just to have officers living in San Francisco, which is quite the luxury, and giving them more money isn't necessarily always a solution, but also to have a diversity of officers, so people of color doing the policing within these communities where there is high incidences of police interaction with community members. I know, like, for the meter maids in San Francisco, at least in the Bayview, Hunters Point, where I live, the meter maids are usually from Hunters Point. They're usually black people from Hunters Point. The minibus drivers are usually black people from Hunters Point, people who drive the 44 and the 23. And I think that those two departments do that so that the community knows who's driving their bus, the people know who's giving them their tickets, and there's this relationship with those people. And I think that it's not enough just to have officers who live in San Francisco. There should be officers of color, officers who live in those neighborhoods and who have relationships. And if you don't have officers who are applying to be police officers, then I feel like it's the job of the police department to go out and recruit people of color to be a part of the police academy.
I mean, I agree, that's a really good point. I just want to say that's a really good point. San Francisco has close to 50% women, and we do have probably the highest diversity, but it could be better. I agree. That's an important point.
I wanted to add something too, but
Sure.
do you want to
Well,
ask?
I just, responding to what Atisha was talking about, specifically for Bayview Hunters Point, I don't know, how do everyday citizens, black or not black, you gave the sense that there's distrust of the police. And part of the reason there's distrust of the police is because we don't live in the neighborhood. So are the people who live in Bayview Hunters Point aware of the police commission, aware of the mechanisms, and are there a lot of bad things happening despite all the procedures that shouldn't be happening? I don't even know what are the real police shootings, are there real police shootings happening frequently in Bayview Hunters Point, and can you comment on that?
I would say that there is a heavier presence of police officers in the Bayview because of the fact that there are more people of color and it's seen as a bad neighborhood. And when it has that stigma, then I feel like it becomes more socially acceptable for there to be so many police in one area. And I think that as far as police involved incidences, I know, like, Kenneth Harding, he was murdered in 2011 by SFPD on 3rd Street in the Bayview. And he was shot multiple times, and the video is on YouTube, you can see it. And he was a 19-year-old, and that happened in the Bayview. And so the sense that, I mean, this happens across the country, that you can shoot somebody and be the judge, the jury, and the executioner, and giving one person that power to murder black and brown people is not okay. And those things happen so frequently in black and brown communities. So whether it happens once a year, once every other year, those things should never be allowed to happen. And I think that that's where the accountability comes in, and the retraining, and police being taught to de-escalate situations. Another incident happened around New Year's Eve this year where a police officer knocked a disabled man out of his wheelchair. I don't know if you guys seen that video. You can watch that on YouTube as well. SFPD pushed a man out of his wheelchair. And why are things like that happening when these people are here to protect the community and protect the citizens? Our money goes to their salary, and so they should be here to serve us. Again, it should be like the fire department. They should never be here to harm us. We should be able to call them and come when we need help. They should never be here to be the ones harming.
Yeah, and if Oh,
I want to hear your,
Yeah, go
well,
on.
an additional incident, if you all read in the paper, there was a police officer that was on disability, and he was arrested by other officers, right? He tried to, was this in the Bayview also? You remember this news report? There was a police officer that was on medical leave who was arrested by other officers because he was basically correcting officers on the questions and the policies they were using when they were engaging him. So they ended up arresting him, and they didn't know he was an officer, and he tried to explain to them, this African-American police officer, that I am an officer, and I had forgotten about this until a police officer last week reminded me of it. I was talking to a police officer at an event that I was at about this amount of mistrust in the community. Petra highlights a lot of the sort of services that are entangled in some of our community work. We have officers in schools, we have some coaches that are police officers that work with our youth, but the quality of those programs is still very questionable. The extent that police officers actually participate in that is still very low. And so if we talk about policy that makes a requirement, 20% of officers' time should be out of uniform, working in the community that they're policing, where they're given opportunities to engage with community in a new and interesting way. Because that, I think, is a great way to build relationships. It will translate over to how they engage when they're on their beat, and all the stuff around, not having the requirements in place. I mean, that's why we have a commission, right?
Right.
We should be working with them to implement some of this stuff. And the last thing that I'll say is, if you all, are people familiar with Malcolm Gladwell? He wrote all these books, Tipping Point, and all. He has this lecture where he talks about a policing policy that was happening in New York, where the police officers are actually following kids' social media messages and finding out they were admitting to a lot of crimes that they were doing over social media. Police officers went to the parents of these kids saying, like, listen, can you help us? We know your kid is up to X, Y, and Z. Parents didn't trust the police officer. They didn't get any support. So as a result, the police decided to, on Thanksgiving and Christmas, go into housing projects and give turkeys to everyone in their home. And people broke down and cried, and they built all these trusting relationships, and that sort of set a new tone for how they were engaging with the community that they serve. So, I mean, we have things that are happening across the country that are really interesting. We have things that we can point to that are happening in San Francisco, but I would say that, that doesn't tell the full story. So I think there are a lot of opportunities is what I'm saying, and a lot of ways we need to improve.
Well, let me just correct something. I just want to add something and kind of correct something. I mean, the Bayview is 6% African American. It's mostly Asian, actually now. One of the things that the officers, one of the things the police are using is CompStat. And last week, for instance, 19 shots fired at the Bayview, and a young mother was shot in the head and died right there. So what we do is what they call smart policing, is where there's activity that needs policing, that's where we put a lot of the resources. So, coming from the Mission District, I know sometimes it feels like we're under siege. I know that mentality, but I also understand that we need to put the resources where the crime activity is occurring. We had 4 people shot in the Western Addition, a lot of shots rang out there, and we have to put the resources where the crime's occurring.
I also think that it's important that instead of money going to militarizing police departments, paying for sick leave or paid leave when they get in trouble, I think that it would be better to invest that money into youth development programs and ways to stop violence in the community, because so the reason why the Bayview is 6% African American at this point, from being historically 60% African American, is because of gentrification, because of gang injunctions, because of the prison industrial complex, and Black and brown youth being locked up all the time, and people being displaced from their homes. Because if you commit a crime and you live in the housing projects, even if your grandmother is on the lease, you get kicked out of your housing projects. And so what that means is that Black and brown people are being pushed out of the city on top of being brutalized by the police. And so if we could have more money going towards programs that combat that violence, and also that same day that the mother was murdered in the Bayview, a young black male was murdered in the Bayview 10 minutes before that, and the conversation is never about him. Although both of those lives were lost, I think that there's something to say about the fact that no one talks about the young black male that was murdered 10 minutes before.
Okay, and I'm going to have Ross Mercury, Sheriff Mercury, join the conversation.
All right.
Welcome. Nice to see you also. And if you could just, we know who you are. But just a little brief something about who you are, what you do, and what you feel your relationship is to our overall discussion about whether or not here in San Francisco we are holding ourselves accountable for things that occur so that we don't have another Ferguson or Staten Island.
Nice to see everybody, and I'm sorry I'm a little bit late. I was at the Portola Hill Democratic Club, and there is a forum like this going on, and I was speaking at that. So I was glad I was able to come over and make it. I'm Ross Mercarimi. I'm the sheriff of the city and county of San Francisco, and I'm a former supervisor of this district, District 5. I was the supervisor here for 7 years. Relative, I think, to your question, speaks to the experience that I had here as supervisor. When I was elected to office here, this district had the second highest homicide and violent crime rate for 20 years. And I felt that that was a result of the apathy of the community, because just how deflated the community was, because there was no interruption in that violent crime rate, and with law enforcement in City Hall who were kind of shrugging their shoulders, acting like that's just the norm of the Fillmore and the Western Addition. I wouldn't accept it. And if some of you may recall, I legislated, and it was extremely unorthodox for a legislator to do this, but I legislated a prescription of what community policing was going to look like in demanding that the police department, like this station, walk beats in some of the most distressed areas of the Fillmore and Western Addition in public housing in areas where they would never get out of their car. And the reason I did that was because not just to be there to show a level of police presence, but because what was central to where there was so many breaches of where communities were experiencing violent crime was the lack of trust between law enforcement, government, and the communities in which they were going to serve. So having some level of continuity where they were held accountable, law enforcement, and concurrently when we were installing programs literally in public housing and surrounding communities where people were coming out of the jail and the prison so there would be better reintegration back into communities, by that time, our legislation became so controversial that Mayor Newsom vetoed it. But I delivered the first veto override of his career as mayor, and I got exactly what I wanted. And for 2 years, we were able to get the kind of community policing, not exactly, on the A level I wanted it, but better than really almost any other district in this district. And there was a quantifiable improvement where community was really at the helm, not police. Community policing is about community is at the helm, and we come with it. And just in December, I went and met with President Obama's point person on community policing, Ron Davis. Ron Davis is the director for the federal government community-oriented policing strategies. And I knew that in the wake of Ferguson and Staten Island and Cleveland and others, while there was this new sort of outcry for community policing and body cams and everything like this, I thought it was a complete miss. They were not talking about the very same strategies for inside the prisons and jails. I'll tell you who's one of the best practitioners of community policing, the deputy who walks the line in the jail system every single day, who has a relationship with the people who are in their custody, who they see 24/7, who are developing the kind of rapport that can make or break what that existence is going to look like while they're in our custody. And the same people that go back out in the communities, well, they'll take that experience with them. So I was saying it's a miss for the federal government to be talking about upgrading strategies in public, but excluding the question of what happens inside prisons and jails, just like body cameras. I mean, body cameras is something that I think should happen. I don't think it's a cure-all by any stretch of the imagination, but I thought it was a miss that they didn't have talking about body cameras for our deputies inside jails, or who governs prisons and jails. Death in custodies, for example, that should be a very transparent moment. And if cameras inside a jail or a prison don't pick up where there is that potential abuse that does happen, or where there's questionable deaths or violence inside of a jail system, a body camera would do very good here. I think San Francisco has shifted away from real community policing. I would like people to consider the assets that are underutilized in San Francisco to help with community policing. I'll give you an example. I preside over the second largest law enforcement agency in the city. Never does anybody enter the discussion when I'm hearing these clarion calls, we need 200 more police, let's hire the police. Well, I've got deputy sheriffs who are trained in the exact same vein, and they're paid 24% less, and it's a taxpayer boon. If you want to have extra beats on the uni bus, if you want people to walk, in public housing or distressed community, you want to go into neighborhoods where others won't go, we're eager, and we're willing to work with community. And I think that that's a factor that isn't often calculated into what is before us that we can actually deploy. And the reason I'm able to say this is, whether you know this or not, I preside over the most undercrowded jail system in the United States. In 3 years, our jail population has plummeted by 50%. Our ceiling is 2,450, our count today is under 1,200. There is no other county system in the United States that sees a jail population transforming as fast as ours. And while January is certainly a cause for concern in the uptick in crime and violence, nothing to turn our back on, certainly I won't. I am liking the indicators overall in the last few years, even with state prisoner realignment, where the governor was required to bring back prisoners from the state because of overcrowding to all 58 counties. And yet still, when they were predicting doom and gloom of overcrowded conditions with an added population, we defied the odds with absolutely an undercrowded jail system. Never before in the history of San Francisco have we been in this position. So when I wrote the mayor a letter, he didn't write back, and I suggested that let's use our know-how and apply it into areas where we really are vulnerable in communities, then I'm making ourselves available. So that's the teaser, and I'm more than happy to plug in. And by the way, I went to school in St. Louis, and I worked in Ferguson. So intimately, I know the area very well, very, very well, and I wasn't surprised what had happened in Ferguson.
Can I just say something? I was a public defender for 10 years, and I saw the jail overcrowding in San Francisco. I saw people, the inmates sleeping on the floors. I saw the deplorable conditions in San Bruno, and I do want to take my hat off to Sheriff Mercarini for reducing jail population. For 10 years, it was always overcrowded, and it was under federal court order. It was horrible, so thank you. And I also want to say something for Letitia. I think she's right. Letitia. She's right about militarization of the police department. They're trying to give all this military equipment to the departments, and that's something as a police commission I do want to stay on top of. I don't think I don't see it as a paramilitary organization. I see it as a civilian police department. And I think it's really important that we're not having tanks, and all that kind of those, or ambulances with machine guns on top. So that's something I would like to get more information on and stay on top of. And I also agree with her, it comes down to money and giving jobs, giving it to the youth, giving it to the people coming out of the jail system and re-entry programs. So I do want to say those are also very commendable and accurate and needed.